Well, let's jump in just a couple verses before chapter 5. So chapter 4, verse 36. Chapter 4, verse 36. Nebuchadnezzar is the one who is speaking, and so let's see what he says. At that time, my reason returned to me, and my majesty and splendor were restored to me. For the glory of my kingdom, and my counselors and my nobles began seeking me out. So I was reestablished in my sovereignty, and surpassing greatness was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are true, and his ways just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride. That's the end of his testimony. And it was a real testimony, a testimony that his life had been changed. And it's amazing that a king over all of the known world empire at that time, King of Babylon, would actually have God himself direct his attention to his life and bring him to the place where he needed to be. He had had these visions and dreams and so forth. He had made wrong choices. And yet God used many things to actually draw him to himself. And the last thing he used was this humbling him. The last thing that he dealt with was that puffed up pride that was coming into his life. And so God, even though he had exalted him as King of Kings and Lord of Lords of that time, he took him down to the level of the beasts and actually brought him to the point where he had gone mad. And then until he actually recognized that heaven ruled, he was staying in that condition. But then he, in fact, looked up to heaven and recognized that his authority only came from the authority that God gave him. And he recognized the fact that there is only one king who is over all things, and that is the king that Daniel served, that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego served. And he makes this proclamation to the entire kingdom. That's pretty bold to do that, to where you're making that statement. He didn't mandate that everybody serve that living God that he had experienced. But on the other hand, I just wanted to bring this point up. You have to know that his testimony being sent to everyone and it being actually pushed out in a sense as a reality that this guy's life has changed had to have an impact in the life of that kingdom, in the life of his nobles, and everyone who heard about it. And I think that because of that, and of course then the fact that Daniel is actually one of the rulers, as well as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're higher up, that absolutely had to have an impact on things from that point forward. What I mean by that is we go from this ruler to other rulers as we go on in this 70-year captivity. God was having his way, and it would have then an influence as we went forward in terms of what God's purposes were. One of the big purposes we've already said is to bring the light to the Gentile world and to let the Gentile world know that the gods that they've been serving are false gods and that there's only one true living God, and he's the God of Israel. So wanted us to be reminded of that. And then let's get a little bit into chapter 5, verse 1. Belshazzar, the king, held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. When Belshazzar tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Stop there. Now, if you're reading through the book of Daniel and you come to this chapter 5, the very most logical thing would be, okay, well, Belshazzar must be the son of Nebuchadnezzar. And the thought would be then that this is that next, in a sense, ruler who would come on the scene, and this is a scene from that situation where he calls his nobles in, and they're all drinking and partying and so forth. And in the process of that, then Belshazzar asks for those actual cups that came from when Israel was exiled and that the temple was destroyed, and bring them in, and we're going to drink from those cups. So it's a little bit shocking knowing how much Nebuchadnezzar's life was changed to then jump into chapter 5 and think, well, these guys, they're not honoring the true and living God. They're actually taking cups from the temple of that God and drinking from them. What has happened? Well, one of the things that you can't see from just reading through is the fact that actually there is a much longer time period between chapter 4 and chapter 5 than what you would immediately think. And there are actually several rulers between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. And we're going to try to reinstate what actually took place so that we can all understand it and see how it all it progressed. But one thing that's important just to recognize is that they're really different. It's really a different season in what we read in chapter 4 from what we're reading in chapter 5. A very different season, and many years later. And we're gonna talk about that. Well, let's go to 2 Kings, which is quite a bit to the left. 2 Kings chapter 25. Now I'm going to read a portion of this passage here in 2 Kings that, in essence, shows some of the ripple effect from Nebuchadnezzar having a life that was changed by God. There's something in this passage that's going to help us to see that it absolutely did change things there within the kingdom of Babylon and change the attitudes of people's hearts. But before we get there, I want us to be reminded of a little bit of history. So remember how we talked about that when Nebuchadnezzar came to Judah, the southern kingdom of Israel initially, he didn't completely destroy it, but he did subjugate them to himself. And so they would pay him regularly and so forth. And basically at that time, the king was Jehoiakim, and he actually was a servant to Nebuchadnezzar. So they weren't in control anymore. That first time, King Nebuchadnezzar also brought back with him some of the nobles, and Daniel was one of those nobles. He also brought back some of the vessels from the house of God. So the cups, the saucers, different things used in worship, he brought those back because they were made of gold and silver. So that was the first wave, all right? Years later, then there was the next subservient king, and that was Jehoiakim. And he came again during his reign because he rebelled against the king. And another group of exiles went to Babylon. They didn't destroy all of that southern kingdom yet, but they did have, again, another exile. In that time of exile, remember who was actually taken? It was Ezekiel, all right? And then the third time around, it was with Zedekiah, who was the ruler at that time. And then when the king came in, he actually that time just destroyed everything. He destroyed the temple, the walls of the city, everything was destroyed. Most of the people who didn't go with him went to Egypt, and in essence, Israel was no more. That is what happened with Nebuchadnezzar as he came against Israel. So the first time through was in 605 BC. Now, he died in 462 BC, and he ruled then for 43 years. 43 years in Babylon. Of course, Daniel was there along with him, but Daniel also lived longer to see other rulers after him. So 43 years he was there. At the end of that 43 years, he had already come to a place where I believe he believed in the true and living God, and he was affecting all of the kingdom. But then, after him, his actual son came to rule, who had a very interesting name, and his name was, see if I can say this right, it was Evil Merodach. Evil Merodach. If you've been looking for a name for your child, you can write that down. Evil Merodach. So he actually was the son of Nebuchadnezzar. So this passage that we're going to talk about actually talks about this particular individual who was Nebuchadnezzar's son, and it's interesting what he did, and you'll see what I mean. So look at chapter 25 and verse 27. Chapter 25, verse 27. Now it came about in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. So this guy had been he was captive for 30, what did I say? 37, thank you. 37 years. So he had been there for a long period of time. So that's when this took place. Look what happens. In the 12th month, on the 27th day of the month, that evil Merodach, king of Babylon, in the year that he became king, released Jehoiakim, king to Judah, from prison. And he spoke kindly to him and set his throne above the throne of the kings who were with him in Babylon. Jehoiakim changed his prison clothes and had his meals in the king's presence regularly all the days of his life. And for his allowance, a regular allowance was given him by the king, a portion for each day all the days of his life. Now that doesn't happen typically with somebody who's an exiled person in somebody else's court that's been actually in prison, and all of a sudden there seems to be a change of heart. I can't help but believe that the change in Nebuchadnezzar's life impacted this evil Merodach's life to the point where he changed his attitude towards Jehoiakim because of his father knowing Yahweh and knowing that, in fact, this king came from the land where the true and living God originally reigned. And so a ripple effect. Quite likely that is the case, that they would treat him so good, have him eating from the same food as the king in his presence. That's amazing. So that's in a sense, the good news. The bad news is, I heard somebody say one time that there's no second generation believers. Meaning this, that just because Nebuchadnezzar believed, and even quite possibly evil Merodach actually believed, that didn't guarantee that from then on in that empire that the rulers would come believing in the one and only God. Everybody has to make their own decision as God brings revelation. Nebuchadnezzar believed. Maybe his son believed. But then from that point forward, it went downhill. And rather than things getting better, they got worse. What ended up happening there was murders, chaos, intrigue that was all part of it. So let me tell you who came into rule after each of these people. So there was Nebuchadnezzar, and then evil Merodach, but he only ruled 2 years. Only 2 years. And he was murdered by a guy named Neriglissar, who is in fact his brother-in-law. Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-law actually killed evil Merodach. Well, Neriglissar actually then ruled only for 4 years. The terms, there's much, much less when there's chaos and evil going on, because they're all clamoring for rule. The next one after Neriglissar was, see if I can say this right, Labaheh Marduk. Labaheh Marduk. All right? He ruled for 2 months. 2 months. That's all he lasted. And then after him was a guy named Nabonidus. Nabonidus was actually someone who would rule for 17 years. And he is the father of Belshazzar that we actually read about in Daniel. Okay, he's the father. So you see that there's this line of rulers that take place. So Belshazzar is not the son of Nebuchadnezzar, but actually Nebuchadnezzar was his forefather, right? And so we need to understand that, because a lot of time has gone by, and what has happened is, particularly actually Belshazzar's father, I always have to look at it, Nabonidus, he actually, he wanted things to get back to the way that they were in the early days of Babylon. And what he meant by that was, and I really believe this is true, whereas with Nebuchadnezzar's influence, a lot of the temples to idols began to be in disrepair because people stopped going to them because of the influence of the true God of Nebuchadnezzar. And so, as a result of that, some of the deities like Bel or Marduk or those ones, they stopped being worshipped. So according to this guy, he wants to get back to the original idols, to the original gods of Babylon. And you know who his wife is? His wife is a priestess to the moon god of Babylon. And so obviously there is a demonic element that is part of that rule. And so Nabonidus actually only spent 7 of his 17 years actually in the province of Babylon. The other 10 years, you know what he was doing? Rebuilding temples. He went to Haran and other places and was rebuilding those temples to try to revive, from his perspective, the Babylonian spirit type of thing. So, because he wasn't in the Babylonian province very often, he put his son as co-regent and let him rule there in Babylon. And that is who Belshazzar is. Now, I want to make also another connection. That means that Belshazzar's mother was the priestess of the moon god of Babylon. And so Belshazzar was honestly, by that time, there was a complete disregard of the God that Nebuchadnezzar came to know. And they had gone back to all of these ways of the past of worshiping inanimate objects as God, gold, silver, different ones of different statues that they would bow down to. So let's go back to Daniel. So with that in mind, recognize the fact that when it says that it uses the term son or father, it's really talking about forefather, okay? And in terms of son, it's talking about descendant. And that's appropriate in the Aramaic here to actually translate it that way. So we're going to go back to verse 1 again. Belshazzar, the king, held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. They're partying, and that's putting it mildly. Verse 2, when Belshazzar tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar, his forefather, had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Why? Why? To show that the gods of Babylon, the old gods, are the gods that have brought the triumph. The old gods are the ones who are the ones that they should be worshiping. And because they are the greater gods, we're going to drink from the cups of this inferior god that came from Judah. And so it's a pronouncement of arrogance. It's a demonstration of the fact that we are the greatest and we serve the greatest gods. And they wanted to boast of that. Verse 3, then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wife, and his concubines drank from them. Notice who was with him. All the nobles, 1,000 of them, but also all of the wives of Belshazzar and his concubines, they were all there. That's important for the future. Look, verse 4. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. It's an amazing thing, when it comes to this what is it with the human heart that, I guess in a sense, we were so much were meant to actually worship. When the true and living God is not there, he is not, in a sense, in your heart, and you haven't subjected yourself to him or realized from his revelation who he is, you have to worship something. And even if it doesn't make any sense, here these are inanimate statues that they walk in with and walk out of with. It doesn't compute to them that it's something that makes no sense whatsoever, because they are so deceived. And demonically, the demons actually will foster that within their lives because of the fact of the emptiness of their soul. And so in and out, they do these things. They bring these statues in, and they praise the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Verse 5. This is all going on, and watch what's happening here. Suddenly, the fingers of a man's hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, and the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. So they all are getting drunk. They are all in, really probably in a state that they are not even seeing things clearly. And something then takes the king's attention. He looks over where the lampstand is that it would actually bring the most attention, and there is a hand there writing something on the wall. Now understand, from the context of this was not like an arm that was coming from behind a wall, and he saw part of the arm and then the hand writing as though somebody was around the corner doing this. It was only a hand. It was detached. And it was writing something on the wall, and it was in plain sight, and the light was actually directed to it so that the king would see it. When he saw it, he was completely brought to his, basically unnerved to the point where he could hardly even control himself physically, as we'll see in a minute. So it had a great impact. So I want to just create the scene. They are doing something that is absolutely offensive to the God of gods in heaven. They are oblivious to the fact that they actually have their life from this God. They are ignorant of the truth of who he is. They've actually ignored what it was that he brought as far as revelation from Daniel, from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the dreams that the Nebuchadnezzar, his forefather, had. They ignored that, all of it. And because of that, God is offended, and God himself is going to actually deal with this king, this one. He is going to bring a message directly to him. Now, before we go any further, I just wanted to share this too. If you were this king and you were having this party, you would expect that there would be a lot of security in the kingdom. You wouldn't be concerned about too much of anything, because you're having all of your leaders come in, and you're really just having such a party that no one is actually in control at that moment. They've all joined you, and you would think that the king would want to make sure that everything was safe and that there's no place that an enemy can come against, because all the leaders are there in that room at that point. But what we know from history is exactly at this time that Persia was behind, in a sense, all of the mountains and the area that was around there, hiding, and they were preparing to lay siege on Babylon right when this was actually happening. And so there was a guy named Ugbaru. He was the commander of an army from Persia, and they had been working to actually prepare to come in and defeat Babylon. Now, did Belshazzar, did he actually know that this other nation was against them? And the answer to that is yes, he did. He did know about it. But he had a false hope, and that is this, that Babylon actually had an incredible thick walled protection all around that city, all around that area. And as a result of that, he didn't concern himself that any enemy could actually scale those walls or penetrate them because they were so high and so thick. Also, if you know about Babylon, actually the Euphrates River goes right through it, okay? And as a result of that, a lot of times when you were being attacked, what the enemy would do would be cut off all sources of water. Well, they didn't need to worry about it because the Euphrates River went right through. And so they had a supply of water all the time. But just in case, they had also prepared for any enemy by actually laying aside supplies to sustain life of food for 20 years. They could actually be besieged for 20 years and still have enough food. So all of that could have absolutely lent itself to them feeling, we can't be penetrated. We can't even be touched because we have everything that we need. Anyone would be a fool to come against us. So even though he knew that they had enemies, he wasn't concerned. And yet, at the same time, what we know from history is what this Ugbaro is doing is he actually went up. There's the Euphrates has a northern part and a southern part. He was having his army on both ends, and then the northern part, what they were doing is diverting the Euphrates to a lake that was nearby so that the water would not go down any longer in the section that went into Babylon. And what would happen is that the river would decline, and when it declined enough, then the whole of all of their armies could go a different way than the wall and actually enter the city. And that's exactly what happened. In history, that's what happened. And that was happening, and they were prepared for that right as these guys are celebrating and praising the gods of all of these things. And so right in the middle of it all, there's this hand that comes on the plaster and starts writing. Okay? Now, I don't know, you probably read this before, and you probably think, well, what's the big deal? But I'm telling you, if we're all talking right now, and there was a hand over there that was detached, I'll bet you would not be paying attention to me anymore, right? That doesn't happen every day. And it's writing something. And it was meant for the king. So again, verse 5, suddenly the fingers of a man's hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster that's on the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. Then the king's face grew pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints went slack. I could resonate with that right then. I understood that. He lost control of his body, and his hip joints went slack, and his knees began knocking together. He was terrified. He knew that hand was for his attention. Verse 7. I bet you it showed up right as he was taking a drink, The king called aloud to bring in the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners. The king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, any man who can read this inscription and explain its interpretation to me shall be clothed with purple and have a necklace of gold around his neck and have authority as third ruler in the kingdom. Amazing. It's amazing that they would make these kind of pronouncements, these kings. In one sense, it's impulsive, but it also shows how serious he took this. That if anybody could just tell me what this means, I'm going to make you the third ruler. And just a point here, he didn't say second ruler, he said third, right? That it confirms the fact that his father was the initial ruler, then he, and now he was going to add a third if this person could tell him what the interpretation was. Verse 8, then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the inscription or make known its interpretation to the king. Now, that's a little bit surprising because what we're going to find out is that they were actually Aramaic words. So it wasn't like it was written in some angelic writing or anything. It was just single words put up there. And it really wasn't that they couldn't read it. It was that they didn't understand why those words were put up there and what the message was that those words then conveyed. In other words, they understood that there was supernaturally some mystery to this, and even though they were plain words, they couldn't receive what it was that the message was behind this. Verse 9, then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed. His face grew even paler, and his nobles were perplexed. You know, everything stopped. They're all trying to figure this out. And these guys come in, and they don't have any explanation. And so that even makes it more worrisome to the king because he knows something needs to be conveyed from that message. Well, in the midst then, verse 10, the queen entered the banquet hall because of the words of the king and his nobles. All right. Was this queen Belshazzar's wife? Well, we know that that's not true because we already said that in this party, his wives were all there, his concubines were all there. So this wasn't his wife. So there's only a couple of choices. This was either his mother, the queen, or more likely his grandmother. I say more likely because if it was his mother, that is the one that we talked about that would actually have been the priestess of the moon god. And I don't think that the priestess of the moon god would be suggesting to have Daniel come in and give an interpretation, knowing what Daniel represented. But the fact of it being his grandmother makes a lot of sense because that would then go back to the time of Nebuchadnezzar, and then also she would have witnessed what Daniel had done, what he had shared, what visions had been actually explained earlier, and even giving Nebuchadnezzar that explanation of not only what the interpretation was, but what the dream was. She would have known about that. So that's who I believe that this is. It's actually that individual coming and speaking in the midst of all this. And she says, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts alarm you or your face be pale. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is a spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your forefather, the king, appointed him chief of magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners. This was because of an extraordinary spirit, knowledge and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas, and solving difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation. Now, a couple things that's interesting is that it doesn't seem like Daniel at this time anyway, under Belshazzar, had any role as the chief of the magicians. He wasn't even considered as such when he called for the magicians and counselors and so forth to come in. Daniel didn't come at all. And the fact that the grandmother needed to remind Belshazzar of this Daniel and who he was and what he was all about in terms of him having the spirit of the holy gods in him, just the fact of her having to tell him that doesn't sound like Daniel was in the forefront. He was off to the side. And so she tells him about this, but isn't it interesting that she calls him Daniel? Nebuchadnezzar gave him that name originally, Belteshazzar, but that name didn't stick. And even the queen calls him Daniel because Daniel is the name that demonstrated the fact that he was of Yahweh. And so she says, that's who you need to summon, and he can help you. Verse 13. Then Daniel was brought in before the king, and the king spoke and said to Daniel, "Are you the Daniel who is one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah?" Some believe that that's like actually a demeaning statement. You're just one of the exiles. And my father, brought you. In fact, my father was the one who brought those vessels, that we were drinking from. Possibly. But one thing's for sure, he doesn't even know who he is. Are you that person? So Daniel was not associated at all with being of help in his kingdom. Verse 14. "Now I have heard about you that a spirit of the gods is in you, and that illumination, insight, and extraordinary wisdom has been found in you. Just now, the wise men and the conjurers who were brought in before me, that they might read this inscription and make its interpretation known to me, but they could not declare the interpretation of the message. But I personally have heard about you, that you were able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. Now, if you are able to read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me, you will be clothed with purple and wear a necklace of gold around your neck, and you will have authority as third ruler in the kingdom." Then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Keep your gifts for yourself, or give your rewards to someone else. However, I will read the inscription to the king and make the interpretation known to him." Just as God had been behind Daniel being a part of Nebuchadnezzar's court and was there at critical times to give messages and interpretations and revelations, just as God's hand was in that, God's hand has been in this with Belshazzar, that Daniel not be there, that Daniel not give the interpretations and not bring that further revelation, because from God's standpoint, Belshazzar had turned his heart away from being open to the living God. And as a result of that, Daniel did not have the role with this king as he did with the other. Which goes to show you, I don't know if this, I hope this makes sense. The Lord, we know that the Lord, over a period of time, he started with singling out a nation. And then he would, from that nation, then reduce it, and then there would be a remnant. But then we get to the New Testament, and it's like individuals, that each person has their own choice. But there's an aspect of this, too, is that God will single out a man, and God will use that man in a powerful way. And he might do that with the man himself, but a couple generations later, there's no indication then that other person who would come afterwards would then respond in the same way, because every single person is their own responsible person before God. They are the ones who will be accountable. And in that sense, in a spiritual sense, there is no second generation believers. And in terms of what God's purposes are, God will actually single someone out for a specific purpose and fulfill it, to the T. But then actually move around from that and go to some other angle with another person, and he's always looking for that one, right? The eyes of the Lord move to and fro throughout the earth, that he might find the one who is perfectly devoted to him, that is entrusting of him. And God knows those who have that type of heart that will be receptive, and he also knows the ones who will be defiant. And so sovereignly, God is over all things, and in this case, the message is going to actually be a message to Belshazzar that his kingdom now is up, and he will no longer be the king. Even though, in an ongoing sense, really the only revelation that this guy had was from his forefathers, but he himself did not have that advantage. So let's read about what the message is going to be. Verse 17 again. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, keep your gifts for yourself, or give your rewards to someone else, but I'll tell you, I will read the inscription to the king and make the interpretation known. Verse 18, O king, the Most High God granted sovereignty or kingly rule, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar, your forefather. Because of the grandeur which he bestowed on him, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language feared and trembled before him. Whom he wished, he elevated, and whomever he wished, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit became so proud that he behaved arrogantly, he was deposed from his royal throne, and his glory was taken away from him. He was also driven away from mankind, and his heart was made like that of beasts, and his dwelling place was with the wild donkeys. That's a point that was not shared before. He was with the wild donkeys, eating food that they would eat, the grass. He was given grass to eat like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he recognized that the Most High God is ruler over the realm of mankind, and that he sets over it whomever he wishes. Yet you, his descendant, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. He knew it. Verse 23, but you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before you. And you and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines have been drinking wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see, hear, or understand. But God, in whom hand are your life, breath, and all your ways, you have not glorified. So this is what you've been doing. You had full evidence of what happened with your forefathers. You knew what happened with Nebuchadnezzar. You knew about him serving Yahweh, but you ignored it all. And then you chose instead to worship these gods that are wood, stone. And you did it by actually taking a cup from the temple of the true and living God and drinking wine from it. And you did it all in the sight of God. And he says this last sentence, in whose hand are your life, breath, and all your ways, and you have not glorified him. You know, there's a constant, there's a constancy in life. And Paul talks about it in Romans, that no one is without excuse. That God has made himself known enough in creation, that his divine attributes, his eternal nature have been seen in what has been made. But what men have done is they've suppressed the truth in unrighteousness. They suppress it. And they choose to not honor him as God. And they choose not to give the glory that he is due. He is always due it because he's God. Amen. He is always due it. And as such, when an individual, whether they're in rulership or whatever it might be, when they choose to actually ignore the true and living God and in a blasphemous way serve something or someone else, and they bow down to whatever it is, God is offended because he deserves that glory. They're stealing glory away from him, and they're suppressing the truth about it, and they're lying against God. And so all the time, it doesn't matter who you are, all the time, you are sustained by God. Your heart's beating because of God. All the time he deserves the glory, and he actually keeps you alive by his hand, and he keeps your ways to be actually a way of life and existing in this planet that he has actually created. And everybody has a choice. Are we going to glorify him, or are we going to steal the glory away from him? Well, this man was stealing the glory away from God. And it's an interesting point here that he says, God, in whose hand are your life breath. Well, God's hand is now what's on the wall writing to him. That hand that's actually keeping him alive now is going to give him a message, and he's personally going to write on a wall so that he can understand it. And so God is addressing him personally, which anytime that God addresses you personally, it should make you tremble. It should, because it's God. So verse 24, then the hand was sent from him, and this inscription was written out. Well, here it is. Now, this is the inscription that was written out. Many, tekel, upharsin. All right, so it's only 4 words, right? But what's that mean? Well, let's look at each one of these. This is the interpretation of the message. Many means God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Well, that root word in the Aramaic, many, is where the word mina comes from. And a mina is 50 shekels. A good deal of shekels is in 1 unit, the mina, right? Now, that's the noun, is many, and somehow from that, there's a understanding that Daniel has that many, in the sense of it indicating 50 shekels, is somehow directly related to the verb that is behind it, and the verb that is associated with that noun is mina, and it is the verb to number, So there were many shekels, the idea that there was a numbering in the process of calculating that, and so the verb behind it is number. And Daniel says, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, because of that, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Well, what's the message? God has numbered your days. God knows how many days this kingdom was to last, and those days are up. That's the first word. That's the interpretation. The days are up because God is in control, and he numbers our days, and he numbers the days of the kingdom. Well, the second word is tekel, or tekil. And it means you've been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Well, you can almost see it in that word tekel. That word is associated with shekel. It means 1 shekel. And that is what the noun actually means, but what does the verb mean? The verb means to weigh. And so from that word, Daniel interprets and says, all right, this 1 shekel, and then the verb behind it of it being something that's weighed out, like on a scale, you have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Back then, scales were used to determine whether you were going to actually get what it was that you were promised. So God not only numbers and determines how long something will actually last, but he also weighs. And in this case, who was being weighed? Belshazzar. And God, when he was weighing this person in rulership, was founding that he was deficient. The weight wasn't there, meaning that he didn't have what was to offer that God intended for him to offer. And obviously, it was related to his choices in terms of his own unwillingness to serve the true and living God. And so, because of that, he was weighed and found deficient. Well, the last one is Paris. Now, I want you to notice something. Look at verse 25 and the 4 words there. And that last word is what? Upharsin. The first part just means and, like the UP means like and, but the last part is like parson, and it is actually something that is in the plural. Whereas the word that Daniel uses in verse 28, Peres, is in the singular. We'll come back to that in a minute. But what does it mean? All right? Well, Peres, actually, the noun, it actually means half of a mina. So, what's half of a mina? Somebody tell me, what's that? You guys are following this. This is good. All right, so like Half of a mina is 25. But the idea is some quantity that gets split in two, and now you have two portions. That's the idea. And so, yes, it means half of a mina, but the verb behind it means to break in two, to break in two. And because of that, this word Paris means your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. What has been given to you by God in all of your reign and dominion, it's going to be split in two, and you're not going to have either half. It's going to be given to the Medes and the Persians, and it will be equal quantities because they will rule together in this kingdom. That's what it means. But why did he say the word singular, Peres, instead of uparsin? I'll tell you why. Because the word Peres is a very close word to paras, which is the actual Aramaic for Persia. So it's a word play. That actually indicates that Persia is about ready to take over. So as he's explaining all this, right then, they are actually making their way across the Euphrates. And the Persians are actually going to come that very night, and they're going to put an end to the kingdom, and they're going to put an end to him because of what God pronounced would take place. Verse 29, then Belshazzar gave orders, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a necklace of gold around his neck and issued a proclamation concerning him that he now had authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. Now, if you got that message, you're going to be destroyed. Your kingdom's going to be taken away. It's going to be divided between the Medes and Persian. Why in the world would you still give the guy a gold necklace and dress him in purple? Well, I'll tell you one reason, because a lot of these prophecies, it isn't for right then, it's for the future. Maybe he was hoping that this is something that will be for a while, but regardless, I'm going to reward the messenger because the messenger knows the true God who's actually saying it, and maybe I can persuade something that I'll have mercy, or I'll have some opportunity that this won't happen. So he does it anyway. He gives them all these things, but look at verse 30. That same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. It happened. And here you have somebody who, in really the most foolish perspective, drinking and having these things of arrogance, of promoting Babylon and just turning away from everything of what had been before. You know what? All of that's going on, and then God has already given the commandment that this is all coming to you. And your days are numbered. You've shown yourself to not have the weight of what it was that I intended for your life, and now it's going to be divided, the kingdom. So what that does, I mean, there's a lot of lessons in here, but I just want to focus on this in the last period we have. God weighs the hearts. God numbers our lives. And God is the ultimate one who establishes our path. And there are many scriptures that talk about that, and I want to look at a few because I think, it doesn't matter that this was about a king. This is true for every human being. And I think it's important that we recognize this message from the Lord. So let's take a look. I want you to go to 1 Samuel chapter 2. This is one of my favorite of the different passages that talk about God weighing our hearts and being sovereign. This one was actually spoken by Hannah. And I love the whole testimony that she gives. If you get a chance some other time, read the whole thing. But I just want to pick two verses. In 1 Samuel chapter 2, 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 2. Look what she says. And, she was saying this because God had granted her a child, God had finally fulfilled her heart's desire, and she was just in the Holy Spirit giving worship to God. I love it. So, verse 2. There is no one holy like the Lord. Indeed, there is no one besides you, nor is there any rock like our God. Boast no more so very proudly. Do not let arrogance come out of your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and with him actions are weighed. Hear that? Don't be so quick to be prideful. Don't think you're standing solidly when you're not. You're dependent upon God because he is the only rock. In many places in Scripture, they say, I know no other. There isn't another God. And Hannah realized that, and he said, anyone who is puffed up and proud, realize the Lord is a God of knowledge, and with him actions are weighed. You know, you're a believer in Jesus, likely, if you're here. But whether you are or not, God actually weighs your actions. What's that mean? It means it's not about just what you do, but why you do it. It's the motive of our hearts. And God can do it perfectly, and he won't accept. It will be actually something that is deficient if the heart isn't right, no matter what it looks like on the outside. God knows the heart. Well, another passage. Turn to the right a little bit and go to Proverbs. It's not a little bit, it's actually a lot. Proverbs chapter 16. Proverbs 16:2 says this. 16:2, all the ways of a man are clean in his own sight, but the Lord weighs the motives. Isn't that true? I mean, isn't it true that most of us, we self-rationalize and we can't see what's really going on with us? So from our perspective, all of our ways are clean. But that doesn't clear us, because God actually weighs the motives of our heart and knows the reason why we do what we do. And he does it perfectly because he can examine us even from afar. His ways are inscrutable. They can see right in and know where we stand. Turn now a little short and go to Proverbs 24. This one of, next to Hannah's, this is the one that I think the most, it touches my heart, I'll put it that way. Proverbs 24:12. Proverbs 24:12. If you say, see, we did not know this, does he not consider it who weighs the hearts? And does he not know it who keeps your soul? And will he not render to man according to his work? Have you ever made a statement consciously or unconsciously? Well, I just didn't know about that. You know, what are you doing? You're claiming ignorance. I just didn't really know. I didn't really know it was that bad. Well, the answer here is, does he not consider it who weighs the hearts? In other words, even that can actually be a reflection of a wrong attitude that you're trying to actually cover it up. It's one thing to do something wrong, but then to try to cover it up is something even worse. And does he not know it who keeps your soul? Does God keep your soul? He keeps everybody's soul. We're all alive because of him, right? And will he not render to a man according to his work? He will. You say, yeah, but I'm a believer. I'm saved. I don't need to worry about that. Well, you don't need to worry about it from the standpoint that if you're truly saved, you're going to be with him in heaven. But I will say this, even for a believer, we are going to have a time where we come before the judgment seat of Christ, and our works are going to be actually seen, whether they're wood, hay, or stubble, or gold, silver, and precious gems. And it all comes down whether what we did actually was of good heart or not, and whether it brought glory to God. That's what it's all about. And so we will all have a time where our works will be put to fire. And the ones that don't get burned up are the ones that are they're going to come with us into the heavenly places, and they're going to glorify our Lord. But the rest will cease to exist and will have missed an opportunity to bring God glory in that way. Well, turn with me to Luke 12. Luke 12. Now, I'm going to share, so it's just going to share the parable itself, but I want to share something Jesus said before the parable. So Luke 12, verse 13. Luke 12, 13. Listen to this. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." And Jesus said to him, "Man, who appointed me a judge or arbiter over you?" And then he said to him, "Beware and be on your guard against every form of greed, for not even when one has an abundance does his life consist in his possessions." Well, that was the circumstances. So here, a guy comes, says, "Hey, these other family members, they're not sharing the inheritance. They just won't do it. So I got to find some way to get them to do this." Oh, Jesus, he's like a rabbi. He's somewhere up there spiritually. So I'll go to Jesus. Jesus, they won't share the inheritance with me. Will you get them to do that? And Jesus says, "Man, who made me an arbiter? Who made me the one who's going to solve this problem between you and them?" And then he says, Jesus does exactly what those passages we're reading say, and that is he goes to the motive of the heart. He says, "Okay, I'm not going to tell you, okay, all right, start sharing that equally." He actually addresses the guy who's bringing it up, and he says, "Be careful of greed. Be careful of your heart attitude in this, that you want more, because you know what? A soul does not consist of what you own. A soul is given to you by God." And so he actually does judge in that situation by addressing the true motives of what that man was all about. And then he gives this parable, verse 13. Am I right? Yeah. Someone in the crowd said to him, no. Where am I? 16, thank you. I switched it. Okay, 16. And he told them a parable saying, "The land of a rich man was very productive. And he began reasoning to himself, saying, 'What shall I do since I have no place to store my crops?' Then he said, 'This is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your soul is required of you, and now who will own what you have prepared? So is the man who stores up treasure for himself. It is not rich towards God.'" The parable speaks to the fact that this man, he was a rich landowner, he was making so much, and he had so much he couldn't store it in the barn. So what does he say? Rather than giving it, he stores up more. And he was greedy. And he says to himself, once he gets it all built, says, "Okay, now I'm going to eat and I'm going to drink and be merry." But he doesn't realize that God is going to require him his soul. And Jesus calls him a fool because he thought that he could find the value in what he owned rather than the value in what God did in his life. And his motives were wrong. And you know what? That's exactly what Belshazzar did. Belshazzar didn't know that God was going to require his life that night and require the kingdom. And as a fool, he had a party instead. He ate and he drank and he was merry. But all along, God examined him in the number of his days, of the weight of his life, and then made the determination, your kingdom is divided, and tonight is the night that you're going to come, and you're going to be held accountable for everything that you've done. So, God weighs the hearts. Last one. 1 Corinthians chapter 4. 1 Corinthians 4 says this, verse 3. Chapter 4, verse 3. But to me it's a very small thing that I may be examined by you or by any human court. In fact, I don't even examine myself. For I am conscious of nothing against myself, yet I am not by this acquitted, but the one who examines me is the Lord. Paul had learned even his own self-examination couldn't be true because he was, in a sense, limited by his own perspective. He learned to rely upon the Lord himself to actually be the one to weigh him and to examine his heart. And he learned to trust in what God said about the situation. Verse 5, therefore, do not go on passing judgment before the time, but wait until the Lord comes, who will both bring to light the things hidden in darkness and disclose the motives of men's hearts. And then each man's praise will come to him from God. He's perfect. He will judge every single one of us. Paul tells Timothy, he says, take close examination of your own life. You know, there's a time that it can be selfish, but we really do need to realize that God is going to examine us, and we need to let the Holy Spirit give us a sanctified idea of where we stand with the Lord. Because we won't be held accountable for the things that just simply we go through the motions with, and we do. Our heart attitude in it is what God is going to look at, because that is the determiner of whether he will truly receive the glory or not. That's our God, and God is faithful, gracious, wise. He's sovereign, he's powerful, and even though you don't realize it, every day he is watching why you do what you do and what you do. And we will stand accountable. And you know what? That's the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom.